Norris was rushed to a hospital in Hawaii where he lived on the island of Kauai with an undisclosed health emergency. Reports say he was in good spirits, even speaking on the phone. But then his health took a sudden and dramatic turn for the worse.
There are very few people in the history of Hollywood who have managed to say so much by saying so little. Meryl Streep is one of them. For nearly 5 decades, she moved through the industry with the composure of a diplomat and the discipline of a scholar, carefully curating every word she offered the public. Interviews were thoughtful. Award speeches were gracious. Even in moments of controversy, she remained measured, deliberate, and precise. She was a woman who chose her battles in private and presented only her finest self to the world. That is what made recent revelations so striking. As Streep moved into the later chapter of her life, past 70, past the point where legacy feels more important than reputation management, something began to loosen. Not in a reckless way, not in the way of bitterness or self-pity, but in the way that happens when a person stops caring about protecting other people's feelings at the expense of their own truth. She began to speak, and what she said sent a quiet tremor through the entertainment world. Because the names she cited, the actors she described as genuinely difficult, creatively incompatible, or personally intolerable, were not obscure figures. They were not forgotten co-stars or bit players from forgotten films. They were giants. Icons. People audiences had assumed she admired, perhaps even loved. The reality, it turned out, was considerably more complicated. What follows is not a tabloid exposé, is not gossip dressed up as journalism. It is the story of a woman who devoted her life to the highest standards of her craft, and what happened when she encountered others who did not share those standards, or who shared entirely different ones. It is also, perhaps, the most honest portrait of Hollywood's creative culture that Streep has ever allowed the public to see. 6 actors, 6 stories, a lifetime of professional experience laid bare with the precision she brings to everything she does. To understand the friction between Meryl Streep and Alec Baldwin, you first have to understand what acting means to each of them at a fundamental level. For Streep, acting is architecture, is the meticulous construction of a human being from the inside out. The research, the psychology, the vocal work, the physical transformation, all assembled with the patience of a craftsperson who knows that shortcuts produce hollow results. Every scene she enters, she has already inhabited for weeks or months. She knows not just what her character says, but why, and the precise emotional history that produced the impulse. Baldwin has always operated from a different philosophy. He is a naturalist, a man who trusts instinct over preparation, and who believes that the best moments in a performance cannot be planned, they must be discovered in real time. He is charming, quick, gifted with an improvisational intelligence that made him one of the most watchable actors of his generation. But he's also unpredictable, prone to rewriting lines mid-scene and following creative impulses that had nothing to do with what was rehearsed. When director Nancy Meyers brought both of them together for the 2009 romantic comedy, It's Complicated, she likely believed their differences would create the kind of productive tension that makes film surprising. Instead, it created something more like a sustained low-grade professional conflict. Crew members who worked on the production later described an atmosphere of barely concealed tension whenever the two shared a scene. Streep's body language shifted when Baldwin departed from the agreed text. Her posture tightened. Her eyes recalibrated. She never raised her voice. She never made a scene. But in the quiet moments between takes, her frustration surfaced. One person present recalled her saying that comedy, to be effective, must be anchored in emotional reality, that without that anchor, it becomes performance without substance. It was a pointed observation, and everyone on set understood who it was directed at. Baldwin, for his part, was entirely unbothered. He described the experience with a grin in later years, suggesting that Streep's displeasure had done nothing to diminish his enjoyment of the process. The dynamic revealed something important about Streep's values. She was not simply a perfectionist. She was a woman who believed in the sanctity of agreed creative choices, in the idea that collaboration requires a baseline of mutual respect for the work as it has been developed. When that respect was violated, even casually, even cheerfully, it registered as a kind of betrayal. She and Baldwin have not worked together since the film was released, and by most accounts, there's been no particular desire on her side to change that. Sophie's Choice, released in 1982, is one of the most emotionally devastating films ever made in the American cinema. Streep's performance as Sophie Zostawski, a Polish Holocaust survivor carrying an unbearable secret, is widely regarded as among the greatest in screen history. She won her second Academy Award for it, and the role became a defining touchstone not just of her career, but of what film acting could accomplish at its most ambitious. What audiences did not see was the creative battlefield that existed behind the camera during production. Kevin Kline, who played the volatile Nathan alongside Streep, was a gifted stage actor with enormous natural talent and a theatrical instinct for spontaneity. He was not indifferent to preparation. He simply approached it differently, valuing emotional availability and improvisational readiness over the kind of granular, research-intensive construction that Streep favored. The difference might have been manageable had Kline kept his opinions to himself. But he did not. At a tense moment during rehearsals, when Streep was working through her accent, an accent she had spent months developing with a dialect coach, grounding it in the specific linguistic dislocations of Sophie's dual identity as a Polish woman whose German was acquired under duress, Kline reportedly stopped the session and asked whether audiences would truly care more about her vowels than about the raw feeling of the scene. To Kline, this was probably a reasonable creative question. To Streep, it was something close to an assault. Because for her, the accent was not a technical decoration layered on top of the character, it was the character. Sophie's voice was the map of her trauma. The shifting sounds, the involuntary switches, the layered linguistic identity of a woman torn between cultures and histories, all of it was inseparable from who Sophie was and what she had survived. Kline had not simply questioned a choice. He had questioned the entire foundation of her creative process. She remained professional throughout the shoot. She always did. But crew members noted the shift in warmth, the invisible wall that descended after that rehearsal. A producer who worked closely on the film later said that while Streep continued to respect Kline's talent, she never fully trusted him again. The two won awards. The film was celebrated, and they never worked together again. In the decades since, multiple projects were proposed that would have reunited them. Each one quietly fell apart. Industry insiders understood the reasons without needing them to be stated. There is a version of film history in which Meryl Streep and Jack Nicholson made several films together and produced some of the most electrifying work of their respective careers. Producers dreamed of it. Studios planned for it. Scripts were developed with both of them in mind. The combination seemed inevitable, her surgical precision, his volcanic unpredictability, both of them capable of extraordinary things. The chemistry on paper was irresistible. It never happened. And the reason it never happened tells you a great deal about what Streep considered non-negotiable in her professional life. Nicholson is one of the most naturally gifted actors the American cinema has ever produced. He is also, by his own cheerful admission, a man who views intense preparation as an obstacle to authentic performance rather than a path toward it. In interviews over the years, he made no secret of his skepticism toward method-heavy approaches to the craft, suggesting at various points that actors who disappeared too deeply into research were missing the point, that the audience came to see something alive, not something studied. When remarks in this vein reached Streep, and in an industry as interconnected as Hollywood, they always did, the reaction was not anger so much as a profound, settled contempt. Not for Nicholson personally, but for what his attitude represented. He was perhaps the most powerful star in the industry. When a man of that stature mocked careful preparation, he gave permission to an entire culture to devalue the work. For someone who had spent her life building her craft with almost religious devotion, who had learned Polish and German for a single film, who had immersed herself in the psychology of real survivors, the casual dismissal felt like a desecration. Casting director Juliet Taylor, who worked closely with both actors throughout this period, is reported to have described the divide in stark terms, suggesting that in Streep's estimation, Nicholson embodied precisely the kind of stardom that she believed was corroding the culture of the craft. He was brilliant, yes, but he was also a man who had made his brilliance seem effortless, and in doing so had convinced a generation of filmmakers that effort was unnecessary. Streep never made a statement. She never gave an interview in which she named him. She simply declined every project that placed her alongside him, quietly and without fanfare, and the collaboration that so many people in Hollywood believed was inevitable never materialized. It remains one of the great absences of the American film canon, a partnership that existed only in the imagination. Of all the names on this list, Dustin Hoffman's is the least surprising. The events that took place on the set of Kramer vs. Kramer in 1979 are not entirely unknown. They have been referred to in fragments over the years, in books about Hollywood history, in Streep's own carefully worded public statements, in the hushed conversations of people who were there. But the full picture has never been assembled in one place. And the full picture is considerably darker than the fragments suggest. Hoffman was, and is, a performer of extraordinary dedication. His commitment to the method, the school of acting that demands the performer live, in some real sense, inside the psychological reality of their character, is legendary. He went to enormous lengths for his roles, subjecting himself to physical extremes and psychological pressure in pursuit of what he believed was authentic truth. His talent was undeniable. His Oscars were deserved. But on the set of Kramer vs. Kramer, his methods crossed a line. Meryl Streep had been cast as Joanna Kramer, the woman who abandons her husband and child, and then fights to reclaim the son she left behind. It was a difficult role in a difficult film, requiring a performance of great emotional complexity, a woman who had done a terrible thing for complicated, comprehensible reasons. Streep prepared for it the way she prepared for everything. Carefully, thoroughly, with full awareness of the psychology she was being asked to inhabit. What she was not prepared for was Hoffman. Specifically, what happened during an early scene in the production when, without warning or rehearsal or discussion, he struck her across the face. Hard. The sound carried across the set. The crew froze. Streep did not cry or shout. She went still, the kind of stillness that is far more disturbing than any visible reaction because it suggests a person processing something they cannot immediately categorize. Hoffman's defense, offered both in the moment and in subsequent years, was that he was trying to generate a genuine emotional response. That the spontaneity of the action would produce something that could not be accessed through conventional rehearsal. That the scene required a kind of raw authenticity that could only come from real surprise. He presented it, in other words, as a technique. Streep saw it as something else entirely. She described the incident, years later, with the economy of language she brought to everything important. It was overstepping. It was not acting. Those words, flat, factual, stripped of drama, carried more weight than any outburst could have. She was not performing fury. She was stating a position from which she would never retreat. The rest of the shoot was a sustained exercise in professional endurance. Director Robert Benton found himself managing two actors with irreconcilable philosophies, one who believed that boundaries in art were obstacles to truth, and one who believed that the absence of boundaries was not courage, but violation. The film they made together was a masterpiece. Both received Oscars, and they never worked together again. When asked about Hoffman in subsequent decades, Streep chose her words with characteristic precision. Productive, she allowed, but personally intolerable. The tension between Streep and Gwyneth Paltrow is the most unusual entry on this list because it was never about creative process and never about behavior on set. There were no confrontations, no slaps, no dismissive remarks during rehearsals. Paltrow and Streep worked only briefly in proximity, and by all external accounts the interactions were entirely civil. The distance between them was of a different kind, philosophical, cultural, and ultimately personal in a way that neither woman has ever fully articulated in public. Gwyneth Paltrow arrived in Hollywood carrying every advantage the industry could offer. Her mother was Blythe Danner, a distinguished stage and screen actress. Her father was Bruce Paltrow, a respected director and producer. She grew up in a world where the conversation at dinner was about craft and industry, where the right people were already known before she needed to seek them out. She did not have to build a network, she was born into one. And she was genuinely talented, genuinely beautiful, genuinely charming. The combination made her rise feel, from the outside, like inevitability. For Streep, watching that rise was a complicated experience. She had not arrived in Hollywood with such advantages. She had built her career through relentless work, through roles that required her to hollow herself out and rebuild from scratch, through the kind of sustained discipline that does not make for glamorous profiles, but that forms the bedrock of genuine artistry. She had earned every credit through effort that was sometimes invisible to the public and exhausting even to those who witnessed it closely. What graded was not Paltrow's talent. Streep has never been a woman who dismisses talent where it exists. What graded was the ease. The sense that a certain kind of celebrity could be assembled and maintained without the suffering that Streep had always believed was inseparable from serious acting. A confidant of Streep's, speaking privately, once conveyed her assessment in blunt terms. She saw talent without the work, fame without the struggle. Whether that characterization was entirely fair to Paltrow is a separate question, but it was real, and it shaped the invisible wall that existed between them. The wall became harder to ignore after the 1998 Academy Awards, when Paltrow took the Best Actor's prize for Shakespeare in Love. Streep had delivered what many critics considered a defining late-career performance in One True Thing that same year. She went home without the award. She smiled for the cameras. She said the right things. But those who were close to her understood the fury underneath, and the name she did not say but clearly meant when she described the Oscar race as a marketing contest dressed up as an art form. In the years since, Streep has been asked repeatedly about the new generation of actresses redefining the industry. She praises Cate Blanchett, Amy Adams, and Jessica Chastain with specificity and warmth, women who have made their names through rigorous, difficult work in complex, demanding roles. She has never, in any recorded interview or public statement, singled out Gwyneth Paltrow for praise. The omission is its own kind of statement. Paltrow, for her part, has always been impeccably polite, offering the expected tributes to Streep's greatness when asked. But she has acknowledged, indirectly, that the warmth was never returned. Jeremy Irons is perhaps the most surprising name on this list, and the one whose inclusion requires the most careful explanation. He is, by any reasonable measure, exactly the kind of actor Streep should have respected. Classically trained, technically refined, possessed of a voice and a physical presence that made him one of the most distinctive performers of his generation. When the two of them were finally brought together on a project, the expectations were considerable. Here, at last, were two artists who would understand each other. The understanding never came. The difficulty, as those close to both of them would later describe it, was not a lack of talent on either side. It was something more fundamental, a collision between two entirely different philosophies about what acting is for. Streep believed, and has always believed, that the actor's primary obligation is to excavate the truth of a human being from the inside out. The accent, the physicality, the emotional history, the specific textures of a person's psychology, all of it assembled through research and preparation into something that could be inhabited and inhabited fully. Irons was trained in a tradition that prized control, elegance, and a certain kind of architectural refinement. He approached a character the way a sculptor approaches marble, shaping, defining, removing what was unnecessary until what remained was precise and clean. He was not an emotional actor in the way that Streep was. He was a composed one. And to Streep, composure without emotional archaeology was not depth, it was surface. The breaking point came during a rehearsal in which Streep had been working through an accent with particular care, layering the cultural and historical nuance of her character's background into each syllable. Irons observed this, waited, and then offered what he probably considered a reasonable creative observation, suggesting that the audience might respond more to the feeling of the scene than to the phonetic precision. He may have meant it gently. He may even have been right, in some abstract sense. But he had made the same mistake that Kevin Kline had made years earlier. He had asked her to choose between technique and emotion as if they were alternatives, when for her they had always been the same thing. The atmosphere changed immediately. Crew members would later describe the shift as almost physical, a drop in temperature, a hardening of posture, a professionalism so deliberate it became its own form of distance. Streep did not argue. She completed her work. She was unfailingly polite in every subsequent interaction. And when the project ended, she made clear, without making any statement at all, that there would be no next time. Irons, speaking years afterward, was diplomatic about their experience together. He acknowledged that their approaches differed, described her as a formidable talent, and moved on. When Streep was asked about actors who confused restraint with depth, she did not name him. She did not need to. The industry understood. And the collaboration that should have been one of the great partnerships of the era remained, like the Nicholson pairing, a thing that existed only as a might have been. Taken together, these 6 relationships reveal something consistent and important about who Meryl Streep is at the deepest level of her professional identity. In each case, the conflict was not personal in the conventional sense. It was not about jealousy or competition or wounded pride. It was about something that mattered more to her than any of those things, the sanctity of the work. For Streep, acting has always been a moral commitment, not in a grandiose or self-righteous way, but in the sense that she brings the same seriousness to the preparation and execution of a role that a surgeon brings to an operation or a scholar brings to research. When that commitment was met with improvisation,